In spite of my best intentions, this is turning into a Ken Burns miniseries, and it's going to come to an end much sooner than I'd originally planned. But in truth, there's just too many memories and less time than I thought I'd need, so I'll just do the best I can with the time I have left. Now for travels with Granny. Once Alton Dialgo, Granny's mechanic, had determined the old Dodge had done about all it was going to, she got a 1954 Mercury Monterey, which many years later she would give me as my first car. This is Kathy in the actual car in high school. Once tested for a little while, this car was deemed reliable enough that she felt safe in taking us to Valdosta to visit Annie and Uncle Ross. They owned a liquor store just outside the city limits and lived a little ways behind it. Valdosta seemed like another world. Across the highway was a huge drive-in theater where, by some miracle beyond our grasp, Annie and Uncle Ross got free admission. I don't recall any of the movies we saw there, but we got to see Hopalong Cassidy live on stage. To our utter amazement and much laughing, his horse, Topper, took a massive dump on the stage. There was Spanish moss hanging from the trees, and everything was lush and green. Annie had a small decorative fish pond stocked with goldfish. She kept peacocks, guinea hens, and several other exotic birds that we'd certainly never seen before. They also had a talking parrot, whose name I think was Jack. It knew how to say it wanted a cracker, and much to our delight, to cuss. We'd never seen any of these things, and were enchanted by them. We were also allowed to shoot an old single-shot .22 rifle, with the only admonition being not to shoot the birds, other people, or at the highway. I still own this rifle. 2 animals were harmed during our hunts, a rabbit and one of those huge-ass garden spiders. I felt bad about the rabbit. In what I believe was 1957 or 8, Granny and Annie took us on a grand tour of Florida. To set the stage for this, you need to understand that there were no interstates, and most of our trip was on US 41 and US 1, both of which were, and actually still are, in use today, and mostly the same 2-lane blacktop they were back then. These were the 2 primary highways into Florida at the time. Second, you need to realize we were traveling in Annie's 1956 Cadillac. At the time, these were truly huge land yachts. It never occurred to us that our lives depended on this 4-foot 10-inch, 90-pound old woman successfully navigating this hulking behemoth. Our first stop was at the Stephen Foster Memorial on the Suwannee River. His songs were pretty popular back then, perhaps because of Disney's Songs of the South. I recall there was a huge Carillon tower whose bells played some of his songs every half hour or so. Next, we were off to Weeki Wachee Springs, whose advertising signs we'd seen since we crossed the state line. They had glass-bottom boats that we thought were amazing. I mean, really, the thought that you could see right down into the water was just very cool to kids. There were also some seriously large alligators that made that thing at Mr. Stevens look like a lizard. They also had women dressed as mermaids who swam around doing water ballet. I wondered if they knew about the alligators. We also harangued and badgered Granny and Annie to stop at one of the 10,000 brightly painted souvenir stands, all of which had, according to them, fresh squeezed orange juice, which we soon discovered came in smallest Dixie cups we'd ever seen. They also all had rubber alligators, Florida-shaped ashtrays, pecan rolls, and parasols in unlikely colors. A fair percentage of them had alligator wrestlers, but based on the one we saw, Mr. Stevens was missing his gator. At some point in here, we spent our first night in a motel. I don't mean the first one on this trip, but rather the first one we'd stayed in at all. I think most of them had air conditioning, but I know they all had a pool. The former was great, but the latter was essential. In either Tampa or St. Petersburg, we got our first sight of the ocean. It was the most spectacular thing we'd ever seen. No words can adequately describe the awe and utter joy we felt on first seeing this breathtaking vista. It was undoubtedly the first time we had ever seen an unimpeded view of the horizon. It was also, of course, the Gulf, and we were surprised the water was green. That made no difference whatsoever. It was simply beautiful. And I think Tampa, we went out a couple of 100 yards on a sponge boat and got to watch a diver in a bell helmet go down to pick some sponges. They didn't look like any sponge we'd ever seen, and they smell like fish. Again, this made no difference to us, as this was obviously an extraordinarily brave man who actually went walking under the water. After this, we made our way down to Key West, but to get there we had to cross the longest bridges I'd ever seen, and 60 years later, they're still the longest bridges I've ever seen. I don't remember how Kathy reacted to this, and I didn't admit to it at the time, but the fact that the bridge was long enough that in the distance it seemed to disappear in the ocean scared the crap out of me. My best memory here was eating at a restaurant that had all-you-could-eat fried shrimp. Surely this must be some sort of gimmick like the free orange juice, as even at our young ages we realized these scuzzy Floridians were not to be trusted and would take advantage of a couple of naive Georgia kids in a skinny minute. Much to our surprise and delight, the shrimp were the best we'd ever eaten. Okay, they were probably the first fresh shrimp we'd ever eaten, but they were, to kids our age, delicious beyond description, and we were indeed given all we could eat. The only other things I recall were the massive palm trees and guys all over the place selling coconuts. Ernest Hemingway was out of town at the time. I'm sure he regretted not seeing us. From Key West, we took old US 1 to Miami. I remember spending the night there and walking the streets. Miami was certainly not as big as it is now, but it was still a large city. I remember the people seeming to be very happy and full of energy. From there, we traveled north to Fort Lauderdale, where we stayed at the Vienna Motel. For obvious reasons, I still remember the name. It was right on the beach, and we could hear the surf while we slept. This was the first time we actually got to get in the ocean. There had never been anything in our young lives to prepare us for the unimaginable pleasure of playing in the waves. We had never considered the feel of having a receding wave tug on us as it continued the cycle it had been in since time immemorial. Figuring out how to body surf, catch small crabs, and finding the most spectacular shells was pure bliss. We could have gleefully stayed there forever. Granny and Amy would only wade in just enough to cover their feet, but I'm pretty sure if one of those waves had sucked us out to sea, they would have been sad, but also would have figured, what the heck, we've got plenty of those little scoundrels to spare. That's not entirely accurate. I know Granny would have tried to save me. It was with heavy hearts that we left this paradise to make our way up to St. Augustine and Fort Frederica. By now I'm sure Granny and Annie were worn out, but they trooped along with us as we galloped around the fort. After this it was back to Valdosta, Vienna, and then home. I'm sure there are many other things from this trip that Kathy will remember, but these are most of the ones that come to my admittedly ever more fragile memory. In the end, we had seen, eaten, and felt things we never had before, and knew that we were surely among the luckiest kids in the world. In retrospect, I feel sorry for our siblings and cousins because they never got to make this trip. I don't think it was because Granny and Annie weren't willing, but at the time Granny was probably 60 years old and Annie a little older than that, and we'd just worn them out. There's still so many memories of our time together with Granny that I just couldn't get to, but I promise before you get to 75, I'll record my memories of the community house, Andersonville, our trip to Atlanta, life in Byron, and our parents. To expand a little on what I said in the beginning, if time is generous, it leaves us two things. The first being our memories, and the second being the recognition that the wonderful memories are only there because they were made with someone you love. So, as Bob Hope used to say, thanks for the memories. I love you, sis. Hang on for a second. Just one more thing. I believe she's about to show us where the aliens put the probe in. Obviously they threw her back because even aliens have some taste.
He's got like this. That's all, folks.